Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are doing a novel, and it is a Poirot, bien sûr. It is Appointment with Death. Kemper, what can you tell us about the publication history?
So it was first published actually in the U.S. as a serial in Collier's Weekly, and that was in the second half of 1937. Then it was serialized in the U.K. under a different title. This title was A Date with Death. So it actually had an alternate title in the UK before being published later in 1938 in novel form as Appointment with Death. But in this UK serialization, which happened to be in the Daily Mail, I suppose the Daily Mail has changed a bit since then. There is a famous introduction that Christie wrote, which appeared a couple of days before the first installment. And this is the introduction where we get the quote from her in which she calls Monsieur Poirot this detestable, bombastic, tiresome little creature. So when we talk about Christie getting frustrated with Poirot after doing this glut of Poirots in the 30s, this is where that comes from, in this sense that Christie didn't like her detective all that much. However, we are lucky enough that Mr. John Curran, in his second published book, Agatha Christie, Murder in the Making, More Stories and Secrets from Her Notebooks. And as we mentioned before, we will be featuring an interview with Mr. Curran in a couple of weeks, which we're very excited about. But in this second book of his, he actually reprints the complete introduction to the serial, even with her marginalia. And yes, she says that she did get tired of Monsieur Poirot, but that's only one part of this introduction. And I think it's actually worth reading out where she goes after saying that she has had her frustrations with him. First of all, she has a little bit of fun because after she says those mean words about him, she says, he is eternally straightening things, forever boasting, always twirling his mustaches and tilting his egg-shaped head. Anyway, what is an egg-shaped head? Have I ever seen an egg-shaped head? When people say to me, which way up is the egg? Do I really know? I don't, because I never do see pictorial things clearly. But nevertheless, I know that he has an egg-shaped head covered with black, suspiciously black hair. And then she goes on to talk about her affection for Monsieur Poirot, and she writes, but now I must confess it, Hercule Poirot has won. A reluctant affection has sprung up for him. He has become more human, less irritating, and I admire certain things about him. His passion for the truth, his understanding of human frailty, and his kindliness. I just think it's interesting that she obviously had some layered, complex feelings about him. She even ends this introduction talking about which were his favorite cases, and I think listeners to this podcast won't be surprised by the title that she highlights, which is Cards on the Table, because that is the murder that, quote, won his complete technical approval. So with that in mind, let's jump right into the victim of our case here.
The victim is one Mrs. Boynton, who is an American. She is a black-eyed, malevolent, ogre-like matriarch of this American family. She is obese. She's called like a squatting Buddha at various points, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that she is obese.
And she has heart problems, and she appears to die from those heart problems. Save for a pesky mark caused by a hypodermic syringe on her wrist.
I should also mention that Agatha Christie, when she was traveling up the Nile with Max Mallowan and her daughter Rosalind in 1933, she actually came across this family. She came across a domineering horror show of a mother, IRL. She initially wanted to include them within her cast of characters for Death on the Nile. So that early cast of characters that I mentioned in which Miss Marple appeared,
right,
the proto Mrs. Boynton and her children appeared. Obviously, they just didn't fit, but she saved them and she made them into her next novel. So it's interesting that this has a real-life counterpart, not that we know anything about those people.
One would hope that they aren't the horror show that this family is.
Hopefully not, although, close quarters on a steamer, I guess she got to know them well enough that they certainly left an impression.
Yikes.
So suspects, of course, it's everyone. We certainly have a closed circle mystery here. They are cut off, and there are a lot of people here in Petra, which is where most of this story takes place. So first up is Lennox Boynton, who is the eldest stepson of Mrs. Boynton, and he just seems to have lost the will to live. Mrs. Boynton has just sucked it right out of him.
And then we have his wife, Nadine Boynton, and she is really sick of living in this situation. And she's the one person who Mrs. Boynton doesn't really have an effect on. And she sees what's going on, but she can't get her husband to leave. And so, you know, as we are sort of setting off in this novel, she is basically on the verge of leaving her husband.
Next up, we have Raymond Boynton, who is the second stepson, and he's been so cowed by Mrs. Boynton that he can't speak to anyone outside the family in her presence, or even, at least in the beginning of the novel, pretty much even not in her presence. His social skills, let's say, are not on point. He seems very much damaged. Speaking of damaged.
Speaking of, we have Carol Boynton, who's the third Boynton stepchild, and she's like an almost twin to Raymond, and they're incredibly close, and she's also quickly approaching a point of desperation.
I always love, by the way, when male-female siblings are described as almost twins. I guess it can sort of be true, but it just seems weird. I don't know. It's one of those things that you come across in literature,
and like not in real life.
But not in real life. Like in Twelfth Night, they're male-female twins, and obviously that means they're fraternal, so their genetics aren't identical, but they're supposedly look exactly alike. Anyway.
Well, it always gives me also like a weird Flowers in the Attic vibe.
I was wondering when Flowers in the Attic was going to come up, but there is
a Flowers in the Attic vibe.
There is such a Flowers in the Attic vibe to the overall situation of Mrs. Boynton's cruelty toward her children, yes. But then even in specifically Raymond and Carol's sibling closeness.
Yeah, I mean, you also kind of imagine that it's like the whole family is one step away from being served donuts covered in arsenic. Rat poison. Yeah, arsenic. Yeah.
You're the one who's cruel and evil, Mother. You kept us locked up in that attic, and you said you'd come for us after your father died. You never came!
You couldn't let anybody find out about us, because if you did, you'd be disinherited.
Look at us, Mother. How could you do this to us? Here, Mother. Our wedding present to you. Stop it. Go on. Eat it! Eat the cookie!
Next up, we have Ginevra, a.k.a. Ginny Boynton, and that is Mrs. Boynton's only biological child. She's the youngest, and she is so messed up that she is losing her bearings in the real world and living in a fantasy world because her mother has just been punishing her so relentlessly. So her mind is slipping.
Yeah.
It's not good.
No, not a good situation for her. And the other siblings notice it too.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we have Jefferson Cope, who is a family friend of the Boyntons, and he has long been in love with Nadine.
Then we have Sarah King, who I am excited about as a character because we have certainly seen plucky, independent women in Christie novels before. But you know what we haven't seen is a plucky professional woman and a doctor, no less.
Right.
Sarah King is an MD. She just graduated. And she has a lot of pluck and spirit. And she also has a crush on Raymond, who she meets on a train. I believe she's referred to as the girl on the train at one point by Raymond. And she has a good deal of disdain for Mrs. Boynton, not surprisingly.
Right. And then we have Dr. Gerard, who is a famous French psychiatrist. And he befriends Sarah, who he seems to have a little bit of a crush on. And he also takes a very intense interest in the family Boynton.
Next up, Lady Westholme, who is an American-born British MP, and she is famous because of her force of personality. I will note, many people, including David Suchet himself, believe that she is based on Lady Astor, who was likewise an American who became the first woman to sit on Parliament. However, Janet Morgan in her biography says that no, Lady Westholme is actually based on this woman who Agatha Christie came across in her travels in Iraq, who had a very meek sort of second in command, which is a perfect segue into our final individual character, Miss Pierce, who is this nervous, soft-spoken former governess who tags along with Lady Westholme. So apparently Agatha Christie was basing it on them, but it is interesting that there was actually an American woman who was also very much known for being outspoken and witty, and I have to believe that Agatha Christie at least knew that people would think of Lady Astor. And I won't go down that road about Lady Astor, but whoa, is she a fascinating and problematic person. Just putting that out there for anyone who would like to investigate a little bit more. Yeah, Google it up.
And last but not least, although actually definitely least because really they're just kind of given a slew of names somewhere towards the end of the book, but there are a bunch of Bedouin servants. And to say that they don't really have individualized characters would be an understatement.
Yeah.
But they routinely interact with both the deceased and her family. So, I mean, they are somewhat suspects in this.
Oh, yeah, and there's suspicion cast on them
Yes.
throughout the novel, so 100% they count as suspects. All right, well, let's talk about the world as it appears to be. This is very much one of Agatha Christie's traveling novels. We are abroad. We are in the Middle East
We are
once again.
touristing through the Holy Land.
Yes, this is a tour group, and there is a lot of touring that happens here. So we open in Jerusalem at a hotel where everyone has converged to see the sights and hear the sounds of the ancient city. And this is where we're first introduced to Sarah King. Newly a doctor, she had actually just broken off an engagement and was trying to move on from that relationship, much as Agatha Christie did the first time that she traveled to the Middle East after her divorce. And right away, it's very obvious, I think, that Christie has a lot of affection for Sarah King. She basically fangirls in meeting Dr. Gerard, who, as we mentioned, is this famous French doctor who specializes in schizophrenia. And it's charming because he's very pompous, and she still respects him and is excited by him and engages with him, but she holds her own.
Yeah, she does hold her own, because also he clearly sees her a little bit as like a sex object.
Absolutely. She moves on. It's not like she makes a scene and says, "Sir, how dare you?" She kind of plays the game, and she's good at it.
She does. Yeah, she's really good at it.
In the hotel lobby, as these two are chatting, they observe this group of Americans, and that would be the Boyntons. Sarah herself on the train came across the middle child on the family, Raymond, but now he's avoiding her in the hotel. She's clearly intrigued by him. This is the family Boynton.
They sort of have encircled themselves around this older, heavyset woman, Mrs. Boynton, and she is incredibly loud and domineering, and everybody in the lobby of this hotel notices it because she essentially is insisting that each member of the family answer every single whim for her. Something is evidently very wrong with the family dynamics, and both Sarah and Dr. Gerard are very much aware of this immediately. And they're incredibly curious as to what on earth is going on with these people.
And they're obviously very well versed in psychology and the language surrounding psychology. This is where, for a novel that's written in 1938, I think that sort of pondering was a little fresher than it felt, at least to me. Steeping yourself in the language of psychology for as many pages as she does, I got a little bit tired of it, which set me off on the wrong foot a little bit for this novel. But I have a feeling that for a contemporary audience, it was actually somewhat interesting and novel.
It didn't bother me particularly, actually.
And this could also be purposeful, but I felt the book, the first half of the book especially, to feel claustrophobic because there's so much talking over and over and over again about the Boynton family, and I found myself thinking, I get it. I
would like to think it's intentional, because if it is intentional, it's done very well.
Yeah. So Dr. Gerard makes friends with Jefferson Cope, who, as we mentioned, is somewhat involved with the Boyntons and traveling parallel to them. He's an old friend of Nadine, and of course that means he's in love with her. So he gives Gerard and the reader the backstory on the Boyntons, and we learn that Mr. Boynton, now deceased, was a fabulously wealthy man. He eventually married Mrs. Boynton, who prior to marriage had been the wardress at a woman's prison in the States. So she was a big old prison guard, and when Mr. Boynton dies, Mrs. Boynton ends up holding the purse strings, so she controls the money. Gerard realizes that Mrs. Boynton is a tyrant, and that she didn't become a tyrant because she worked in a prison. She decided to work in a prison because she was a tyrant at heart. That is who she is as a person.
Right.
It was, she was born with it.
Maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's
Sadism.
Pure malevolence.
Yeah, it's pure malevolence and power wielding to hold them all in their places, trapped. They don't have any money. They're incredibly worried about Ginny, who's just completely going off her head.
And so Sarah's convinced Dr. Gerard to go with her to Petra. The Boyntons are also leaving, who knows where. But before they go, Sarah sees Mrs. Boynton sitting in the lobby and basically goes off on her. It's out of character for Sarah, but she basically notes that Mrs. Boynton is like a bully and she's pathetic, and that she can say whatever she wants to Sarah because Sarah doesn't care. And Mrs. Boynton kind of doesn't respond to any of this. She's staring over Sarah's shoulder, and what she finally says when she speaks is, "I never forget. Remember that. I've never forgotten anything. Not an action, not a name, not a face." And then she laughs malevolently. And so Sarah's kind of like, and shrugs.
She's like, okay, that was weird. She's
Yeah.
like, I'm embarrassed. You should be embarrassed. Let's move on.
Yes.
We should also note here that Monsieur Poirot also happens to be at this hotel. And it's really odd because we hear from him in the first couple of pages, and then we don't really hear from him for almost half the book. But the reason why we hear from him at the very beginning is that he hears someone say to another person, you do see, don't you, that she's got to be killed. That line of dialogue is, in fact, the first line of the book.
Right.
It's a great first line. You could tell that Agatha Christie wanted to preserve that as her first line, but it's a little awkward that it becomes
structurally weird.
It's structurally weird because and then we find out right away that conversation is between Raymond and Carol, that Raymond is the one who said it. And then we kind of go into what we've just talked about in terms of introducing all the characters, and we neither see nor hear from Monsieur Poirot again until much later. So let's get out of Jerusalem and go on down to Jordan or Transjordania, as I believe it's referred to within the novel.
The Rose Red City.
The Rose Red City.
Yeah.
An original working title for this novel was Rose Red City, so the setting was very important to her, and you can tell. In any case, Sarah and Dr. Gerard decide to go to Petra, and they meet the meek Miss Pierce and the very strident Lady Westholme, who are also going into the city. And when they arrive at Petra, they are informed that another tour group is also at the site. And who might it be? The Boyntons. And Mrs. Boynton is sitting in front of her cave, right?
Yeah,
because there are various caves.
You have an option to stay either in one of the cliffside caves or on a tent.
And of course, Mrs. Boynton is like, I'll take the cave.
Some terrifying gargoyle.
Mama wants her cave. But yeah, like they see her sitting there. And that's when I believe she's described as this sort of like hunched Buddha character sitting in front of her cave.
All right. So they go for various hikes and yada, yada, yada. And there are sacrifice stones and yada, yada, yada. We hear a lot about the details of what Petra looks like. But on the second day, Mrs. Boynton suggests that the family members minus Ginny, maybe they should go on a hike on their own, which is like, oh my gosh. So Sarah immediately thinks something is fishy, but she's also pretty psyched to spend some quality time with Raymond. So they all go along with this, and Miss Pierce, Lady Westholme, Ginny, and Mrs. Boynton stay behind. And on the hike, Dr. Gerard gets a flare-up of malaria.
Hey, when that happens.
Yeah, as one does. And has to wander back to camp. So eventually Raymond and Sarah break off and they get to canoodle alone. And Raymond tells her that she was right and that he has worked himself up and he could have courage. And he insists that he's going to go tell his mother that he's done with her nonsense and that he will see Sarah later.
Right. So the group is back at the camp later on and they're called to dinner. And one of the Bedouins runs back because he had gone to call Mrs. Boynton to dinner. He says that Mrs. Boynton is ill. And Sarah, being a doctor, and of course our other doctor is incapacitated, runs up to the cave where Mrs. Boynton isn't just ill. She is very much dead.
Yep.
We then cut to several days later in Amman, and a recovered Dr. Gerard and a Colonel Carberry, friend of, wait for it, Colonel Race.
Colonel Race!
Little colonel on colonel friendship going on there. We get a nice little cards on the table reference.
We do.
Colonel Carberry recruits Mr. Poirot, who of course is in the area, to help assuage some concerns over the case. Colonel Carberry, even though we are told many times how messy he is in appearance, he has just as much of a fascination for the truth as Mr. Poirot
he also
does.
has a very neat mind.
Yes, he has a neat mind, but a messy exterior.
Mm-hmm.
That mark of a hypodermic syringe on the wrist of Mrs. Boynton's is really bothering him. Mm-hmm. And we learned that Dr. Gerard, in his delirium, couldn't find his hypodermic needle. When he was flush with malaria, he tried to find it and he couldn't. Then when he had recovered, he noticed that his supply of digitoxin, which is the most potent form of digitalis, shout out to the herb of death and Dolly Bantry.
I know.
Foxglove. That was surprisingly depleted. So this just seems fishy. Colonel Carberry needs answers. And Poirot agrees to investigate, promising the truth within 24 hours.
The Amazon Prime of mystery investigation.
I mean, he seems to put that limitation on himself, right?
Yeah, nobody asks him. They say that they can only hold the family for so long, but nobody says it has to be the next day.
Right. And he's like, I'm going to do it in 24 hours. He's like the person who, ties one hand behind his back just to make it more interesting because he's that
Cocksure.
good. So, yeah, I mean, that is where we are in the world as it actually is. Let's talk about some clues, Catherine.
So there are a lot of clues. Many of them are red herrings. And to go one step further with this, while we always advocate on this podcast that if Christie provides a list or a timeline or a diagram, you would best pay close attention. But it's subverted here a little bit.
Right. There's a lot of ink spilled as to the specific times that various members of the party went back to speak or not speak with Mrs. Boynton.
Poirot makes a lot of lists, and we get the list reprinted.
But none of it matters, so we're just going to note that and not concentrate on it as we go through this still rather prodigious list of clues.
There's still a lot of actual clues, but we just wanted to point that out.
Clue number 1. Every member of the Boynton family admits having talked to Mrs. Boynton, sometimes in anger, on their way back from their hike on that fateful day. They each provide specific times, with the last being Raymond, a little more than half hour before his stepmother is found dead. Unfortunately, Sarah insists that Mrs. Boynton had been dead for well over an hour, if not longer, when she discovered the body and did her doctoring. So the deduction here is that someone is lying, or alternately, a lot of people could be lying. Either Sarah is lying and the time of death was just different from what she said because she's trying to protect Raymond, which of course is possible, or Raymond is perhaps lying to protect someone else within his family, such as maybe his super close sister, Carol. We don't know, but certainly at least one person seems to be lying, if not more. And as we've sort of just alluded to, it turns out that many people are lying here.
Clue number 2 is the hypodermic syringes, plural. Dr. Gerard, even in his foggy malarial state, knows that there's a hypodermic needle missing from his bag. But then again, it's back there in the morning. And then it's additionally spotted that Carol Boynton has flung something towards the river, only for Sarah King, of all people, to reclaim it as her own hypodermic syringe. We also find out during the interview with Nadine, who was once a nurse trainee, she also had a hypodermic syringe in her suitcase, but quote-unquote, she's left it behind with the bulk of her luggage. So, the deduction here is that's a lot of syringes. It basically points the blame then at 4 different people, right? Dr. Gerard, Sarah, Carol, and Nadine.
On the other hand, and this is our clue number 3, what is also missing, as we mentioned, from Dr. Gerard's medical case is a large amount of digitoxin. And we do learn that Mrs. Boynton, she had a heart condition, so she was already taking digitalis as an oral medication for that heart condition. So one would, in theory, think that futzing with the dosage of that would make for a smoother crime, especially if you're going to be messing around with digitoxin, digitalis, and, all these affiliated drugs. But no, it seems that instead the much heavier digitoxin was injected, leaving that telltale mark. The deduction here is that that's really curious because it seems like an overcomplication.
Right.
Why not just up the dosage? Why not just make it more concentrated, since you know that she's taking it anyway? Especially because Mrs. Boynton didn't even give herself her medication.
No.
Injecting it with the stolen syringe seems like an added layer of complication. So the true deduction from there is it's really a huge one, actually, because so much of this book and the suspicion in this book is dedicated toward, okay, we know everyone in Mrs. Boynton's family wanted to kill her. And there's even one really funny moment when Murder on the Orient Express is referenced because Nadine, I believe, says, well, you know what? Even if we all did it, didn't you totally let everyone off on that Murder on the Orient Express case? And he's like, that's not the same thing. She wasn't essentially as evil as Cassetti. And Nadine is like, oh, yes, she was.
Well, no, and also Poirot is basically like, how would you know that?
I know. Well, that means someone on that train is telling tales.
Loose lips.
Loose lips. Who do you think it is? I think it's McQueen.
Oh, yeah, it definitely seems like McQueen. McQueen seems like, yeah.
I mean, that might just be because of Josh Gad. But yeah, there's so much suspicion toward the family. But where this clue ultimately gets us is that it couldn't have been anyone in the family, because if it were, they would have just
all had access to her.
They would have poisoned her via the oral medication. They never would have actually stuck her with a syringe. So it's a really classic Christie clue. When you get on the other side of it, you're like, oh, of course. But it's really hard to get there.
Clue number 4, we have eyewitness testimony. And we have said this over and over and over again on this podcast. But in Christie, one sense is not necessarily sufficient for critical witness testimony. And what we find out from Poirot's interrogations is that, one, most of the Boyntons are a little bit fuzzy in their details.
Because they're all totally lying.
Yes, because they're all lying. And that Miss Pierce, in particular, is so much of a nervous Nelly that she doesn't have any faith in her own memory. So the deduction here is that eyewitness testimony across the board is probably not accurate. And especially at any distance, which is what both Miss Pierce and Lady Westholm testify to having seen, because they saw a shabbily dressed Bedouin with patched pants tending to Mrs. Boynton when they were coming out of their tents. So the question is, did they actually see that?
Especially because it was at such a distance that being able to pick up on details such as the quality of this Bedouin's clothes is questionable at best. And it is Lady Westholm, who, of course, is the one who is driving this conversation, as she does all conversations. So
Miss Pierce, who's backing it up.
She just goes along with it. Yeah, but we should start being suspicious of Lady Westholm here. Clue number 5. I never forget. Remember that. Not a face. This would be Mrs. Boynton in the hotel when she was looking over Sarah's shoulder. The deduction there is that Mrs. Boynton saw someone who she knew from the past in the Hotel Solomon early on. And I'm tipping my hand here a lot, but there are a lot of casual references to Sarah just being embarrassed by that whole incident and remembering the fact that Lady Westholm was in the vicinity. And she's like, oh, I hope that she didn't overhear. We are put on notice multiple times that Lady Westholm was in the area when that line was uttered.
Right, and somewhat related to this, clue number 6, nationality. It's fitting, I think, that Murder on the Orient Express is explicitly referenced here because nationality is actually like an important component of that puzzle. And it's important here, too. So the Boyntons are Americans, and it's referenced repeatedly. And it sets them apart from the other characters. Usually, if Christie's going to do that, I mean, I think that it's worth noting why she's doing it. And so the deduction here is, okay, well, what other nationalities are at play? So we have an English woman. We have Poirot, Belgian. We have Le Docteur Français. And we have some extra Americans. We have Jefferson Cope. And guess who else we have? Who's the other American?
Could it be Lady Westholm?
Yeah, it could be Lady Westholm.
All right, clue number 7, Mrs. Boynton's reasons for traveling abroad. This is curious, and this is very much a psychological clue, and it's clever. She's kept her family trapped for years in a house in their cages. So why is she letting them out of their cages a little bit or letting them see the world for the first time? Dr. Gerard and Sarah posit that she's pathetic and she's bored and that she's cowed her family into desperate submission. And now she doesn't, have anything left to play dirty with.
Right.
So she decided to shake it up and torture her family members some more by showing them what life could be like.
Yeah, and that they can't have it.
Right. But there's even a further deduction to make. And yes, I think there is an element of that she's getting some pleasure from that. But I think also she's looking for new game, right? Like she's traveling because why does one travel? Well, partially not just to see sights, but to meet new people. So this means that all of her actions, especially on the day that she died, come into question insofar as how she was potentially creating a new torture game for herself. Was she trying to make someone else's life difficult and then perhaps they turned around and did her in? Let's solve this case.
Poirot basically gathers everyone into this hotel room in Amman, and he separates the group into the family members, and then he has the 3 outsiders who have a stake in this. So Sarah, Dr. Gerard, and Jefferson Cope.
And as he circles through evidence, it becomes very much clear what has happened with the family members. Namely, each of them thought that one of the others had killed Mrs. Boynton. And since they all wanted her dead, again, Murder on the Orient Express is an apt analogy here. Since they all wanted her dead, they've all been covering for each other. Each and every one of them approached Mrs. Boynton only to find out that she was already dead. And then they basically all pretended to talk to her corpse.
Should have been out there sailing with us today, Bertie. Sun was fabulous, wind was fabulous, we had a great time. Oh, hi, guys. Hi. Love you, darling, just love you. You could use a little sun.
So there's really only one thing that matters here, and it's the needle mark on her wrist and the missing digitoxin. Because whoever Mrs. Boynton was killed by was someone without access to that bottle of heart medicine. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. Even though all these people are being denouement style held in a room by Poirot, they're eliminated. And so then if you look at the outside parties in the room, Dr. Gerard was in a malarial fever. Sarah was lying about the second syringe. It was, in fact, Nadine's, which she had said that she'd left behind, but she hadn't. Raymond and Carol had taken it because they'd read in, guess what, a mystery novel, that you could inject air into the veins to kill someone without actually leaving a trace. But, of course, they didn't go through with it. And so Sarah had covered for them when the needle case was discovered.
So, if it wasn't Sarah or Dr. Gerard or Jefferson Cope, he has no real motive, because with Mrs. Boynton's death, it's actually less likely that Nadine is going to run off with him, since Lennox is now functional once again.
Yeah.
Then, let's keep in mind that little bit of tracking about nationalities. Who is the other major American in this story? Yes, that would be Lady Westholme, the Tweedy British MP, who we are told met Lord Westholme on a steamer coming from America to Britain. And that's actually probably the funniest line in the novel, when they say people used that steamer voyage as a cautionary tale against traveling by boat. The fact that she was able to hook Lord Westholme. I think this is one of the more brilliant things about this novel. Lady Westholme is through and through a comedic relief character within this novel. And you know what? She's also the murderer, because it turns out that when she was in America, she was a convict. And Mrs. Boynton recognized her and was going to make her her little mouse in her sadistic game. But Lady Westholme was having none of that. No. So what did she do?
She dressed in men's clothes, wrapped scarves around her head, stole digitoxin and the syringe, and goes up, and then she stabs that needle right on into Mrs. Boynton's wrist and poisons her with digitoxin. She's not about to have this woman recognize her and ruin her life that she worked for. She basically tells Miss Pierce what happened, and then Miss Pierce believes that that's what's going on.
She says that Mrs. Boynton grunted at them when they tried to speak to them, and Miss Pierce backs it up, and that's taken as fact by the reader.
Right.
It's this temporal deception that Christie's so good at. We just assume, wrongly, that the murder had to have happened much later than it actually did.
And, of course, the Boyntons have inadvertently helped her cover up the entire thing, because they were all covering up thinking that each of them had done it.
It's like in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Remember when Flora says that she had spoken with him when she hadn't, and he in fact had been dead, and it had nothing to do with the murder because she was not the murderer, but it was part of this temporal deception. We had it in Mystery of the Blue Train. I mean, it comes up all the time. It came up in Death on the Nile. It's one of Christie's best tricks.
Right.
So yeah, unfortunately, there's not really a lot of evidence to convict on here, but hey, wait a second. Lady Westholme was actually one of the only people not in the room at the time, but you know what? She's in the room right next door, and she has a little accident while cleaning her gun. Yeah, she killed herself. This is another Poirot-induced suicide.
Yes, it is.
And then we get this wonderful little epilogue here, don't we?
We do. So we cut to 5 years later. There is a production of Hamlet on the West End. Ginny is playing, naturally, Ophelia.
Since she is Ophelia. She was Ophelia throughout the novel, so of course she's actually playing Ophelia at the end of it.
And we find out that super creepily, Dr. Gerard has quote-unquote saved / married her. Anyway, she's now a acclaimed stage actress, and so Raymond and Sarah have married, and Carol and Jefferson Cope got married, and Lennox and Nadine are finally happy, and then guess who shows up? Papa Poirot, who just chills at their dinner table and is super excited that they're all paired up and loved up, and
all's well that ends well. The epilogue is a little ridiculous. I believe that it actually didn't appear in at least one of the serialized versions, and I think it might have been a stronger novel without that epilogue. It's
embarrassing a little bit.
It's a little embarrassing.
It's not as bad. It's not as bad as the Harry Potter epilogue as far as epilogues go. But
it's not, but it has the same feel to it as the Harry Potter epilogue. It 100% does. Everything turned out happy.
Here's a pretty ribbon that we can wrap around this.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the adaptations, because yes, there are 2 adaptations of this novel, and I'm just going to come out and say that I think both of them are pretty bad. And it's interesting because this is...
Yes.
I don't think it's one of Christie's best, but I do think it's a strong novel, and I think it's curious that it has been so badly adapted twice.
They were not good.
They were not good. I should mention, though, before we talk about the filmed adaptations, that this is another one which Christie adapted for the theater. And apparently she started writing it in the burst of enthusiasm after being involved with her Death on the Nile theatrical adaptation. And there are 2 things to note about the play version of Appointment with Death. The first really interesting one is that the role of Miss Price, who is Miss Pierce in the novel, they changed her name a little bit, couldn't tell you why, in the West End version was played by Joan Hickson. This has become kind of one of the Christie apocryphal tales that she was so taken with Joan Hickson's performance in 1945 that she wrote to Hickson and said that she hoped one day Joan Hickson would play the character of Miss Marple. And of course she would nearly 40 years later. So that's nice. And then, as she did in Death on the Nile, she excised Poirot from the stage play. But even more interestingly, she changed the killer for this play. And she did not do that often. We saw her do that in The Secret of Chimneys, but let's be honest, there wasn't much of a mystery going on in The Secret of Chimneys anyway. And her ending, John Curran actually thinks that this is a stronger ending, and I have to agree in a way, because in the play version, Mrs. Boynton commits suicide. She basically drops all these red herrings because she's trying to implicate her family so that she can ruin their lives beyond the grave. So it's kind of taking that psychological element to the nth degree. And I haven't read the play. I've never seen it perform, so I have no idea how it works. The play did not do very well. It was not very well received, but it's just really interesting that in that version, Lady Westholme is purely a comic character. There's nothing nefarious going on, and it's all about Mrs. Boynton. So I think that's interesting. And then let's just move on to the first of these adaptations, which is Peter Ustinov in his final of 6 appearances as Poirot in 1988. It's got the same producers as Murder on the Orient Express and Death on the Nile, but apparently the director was not great. Per our friend Mark Aldridge, none of the actors liked him. Lauren Bacall couldn't stand him. The director's name is Michael Winner. John Gielgud apparently said that the character he played here, which was Colonel Carberry, was, quote, one of the least rewarding I have ever played, end quote.
God.
I know, and that's saying something, because John Gielgud played a lot of people, including within Christie adaptations. His name comes up all the time. I mean, for a movie that has Piper Laurie, Carrie Fisher, Haley Mills, John Gielgud, and Lauren Bacall, it feels flat. It feels lifeless. I think the biggest problem with it is that the psychological damage done to the Boynton children is not all that extensive in this version. They just kind of seem unhappy with a normally domineering mother figure, and so much of the power of this book comes from the true sadism and sort of hostage effect that Mrs. Boynton has on her children, and it's just not there.
Right. Although I will have to say, Piper Laurie, just by virtue of being Piper Laurie, it has a certain fear quality. If you cast the mother from Carrie, you're getting extra mileage out of that, you know?
No one's bad in this. I mean, Lauren Bacall plays Lady Westholme, and it's totally one of those cases of the stunt casting that makes you realize who the murderer has to be.
Yes.
So you're like, I don't think Lauren Bacall is playing this random comic relief character. I think she's the murderer. The only other thing I'll say about it, because I think it's so curious, is the way, I've mentioned this before, but the way that these Peter Ustinov Poirot adaptations switch back and forth from being period to not period, because we had Death on the Nile, which was period. Then we had Murder in 3 Acts and 13 at Dinner, which were modern, yet Poirot was still Poirot as Ustinov brings him to the screen. And now this one's period again. Mm-hmm. It's so bizarre. It's like, just choose whether or not to be period. There's no continuity, obviously, between all of these various adaptations. It's no Suchet, which I think is a great segue.
It's a segue, but I will just note, as we seg, the Ustinov version is at least pretty faithful to the text.
The Ustinov version is absolutely faithful to text. The Suchet version, I mean, this is
so far off.
It is so far off from the novel, but not in a good way.
No.
I did not like any of the changes that were made here, and they are substantial. So this was in season/series 11, aired in 2008. So this is Darker Poirot and feature length.
Star-studded cast, I guess. I mean, we have Tim Curry, and we have Elizabeth McGovern, and John Hannah, and Mark Gatiss.
Absolutely. Well, what's funny is that Elizabeth McGovern, who a lot of people know recently playing the American who married into the English aristocracy on Downton Abbey, she's playing the character who is that within the novel. But then in this adaptation, one of the changes they made is that Celia Westholme, I think she's supposed to be British, but she's like a travel photographer who actually, spoiler alert, started life as a maid, got pregnant out of wedlock with Dr. Gerard, who's now a Scottish doctor.
Scottish anesthesiologist.
And they had to give their child up to her sadistic employer, who, of course, would become Lady Boynton, whose husband, Lord Boynton, is still alive. And that would be the criminally underused Tim Curry in this adaptation. He just does not have anything to do. There's a whole subplot with finding the severed skull head of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Like, why is there an archaeological dig here? There's so many other Christie novels that involve archaeology, but this one doesn't. Why did they feel the need to do that?
Why did they have to add a Lord Boynton? Like, why was that necessary?
Why did they have to? Which totally takes away from the dynamic of this mother domineering everything.
No, and you talk about in the Ustinov version, everybody seeming like kind of just like they were like bored.
Mm-hmm.
It's worse in this version. The Lennox character.
Well, because in this version, also one of the other of the myriad changes is that he is the actual son of Lord Boynton, and Lady Boynton is his stepmother. But then all the other children are adopted by Lady Boynton.
Oh yes, and she
so they're not even related to each other. So Raymond and Carol and Ginny are all adopted, and there are constant flashbacks to them being beaten as children, which I honestly found really hard to watch.
It's also because the thing that's so scary in the book is that it's not that they were beaten, it's that it's like incredible psychological damage.
It's all emotional. I 100% agree. The fact that it's reduced to physical beatings just takes away the power of it. It's not. It's overkill the other way, and it's just in its own way as ineffective as what's happening in the Ustinov version. We haven't even talked about the worst edition, which is a total fabricated side plot about a slave trader nun.
Yes.
A slave trader who poses as a nun. She's essentially trying to do to Ginny what's going to happen to Liam Neeson's daughter in Taken.
Yeah.
Hi, Daddy.
You were supposed to call me when you land.
There's someone here.
What?
Oh my God, they got Amanda. They're coming.
All right, listen to me. Go to the next bedroom, under the bed. Tell me when you're there.
I'm here.
Now, the next part is very important. They're going to take you.
And then at the end of it, her comeuppance is that she tries to escape and she gets stranded in the desert. And then we see vultures overhead. It's like, what? It's very odd. It feels very off kilter, and almost like the colors were saturated in a weird way. And even like the camera angles, there's a lot of like first person POV shots that I found odd. It's an outlier among the Suchet series.
I mean, again, obviously it has good actors in it. Like, I don't want to blame the actors, but I would blame the direction for sure. And the story choices.
Yeah. There's one thing I should point out, though, which I found really fascinating that David Suchet writes about in his book. And the final scene of this adaptation is Poirot giving rosary beads to Ginny as a source of comfort. And he says,
"Before he leaves, you will permit an old man to pontificate? Alors, mademoiselle, there is nothing in the world so damaged that it cannot be repaired by the hand of Almighty God. I encourage you to know this, because without this certainty, we should all of us be mad." Je vous salue, mademoiselle. Au revoir.
With that, Poirot walks across the garden toward the hotel exit, and then he's captured in silhouette, which is much like the end of the credit sequence in the earlier seasons when he would be in that little smoky spotlight. And Ginny looks down at the crucifix in her hand, and when she looks up, he's gone. He's disappeared. This was the final episode filmed within that season, and it seemed as if that might be the final Poirot. And Suchet himself thought that it was when they were filming it, and many in the cast and crew thought it was as well. And if you watch it with that in mind, it does have this kind of gloss on it of, and then he disappears into the night. I'm very happy that that wasn't the final episode, because it's certainly not one of the best.
Did they really think that they were going to end the series without doing Curtain?
The only way that you do Curtain is if you've committed to doing every single Poirot, and I think they just hadn't gotten there yet, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
There's no point doing it otherwise. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a rare misstep within the Suchet series. This is not a bad novel, which is a good segue, I think, into our rankings. Yes. Let's talk about plot mechanics. What do you think, Catherine?
Well, here's the thing. It's actually a really simple plot.
I agree with that. I think that contrasting it with Death on the Nile, which we probably really did rank a little low when it came to plot mechanics because we gave it a 6, but comparing it to that, I think that our problem with all the side plotting in that one was that the puzzle mystery was so convoluted and complicated that it seemed extraneous.
Yes.
Here, though, I think the side plots are more tethered to the characters and the overall story, so they didn't bother me. And they're necessary because the puzzle mystery is pretty simple, but simple in, you could argue, a somewhat elegant way. The temporal deception is clever.
Oh, I do think it's elegant, and I actually think the side plots, the obfuscation mechanism with what's going on with the Boyntons is actually necessary to covering up what actually the pretty simple plot is.
Right. It doesn't feel beside the point
No.
either. I wasn't annoyed where I was like, oh my gosh, all the Boynton stuff made this so much more complicated. Well, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
I mean, the Boynton stuff is the point. So I don't think it's one of her most exceptional ones, but I think that it's certainly a solid plot. And since we often talk about plot credibility and plot mechanics at the same time, I think particularly when it comes to credibility, this one does very well because everyone's acting in a way that makes sense to me. The biggest pill I think we have to swallow in terms of believability is this backstory to Lady Westholme. The fact that she was a prisoner and that we have a coincidence here and that Mrs. Boynton came across her in Jerusalem. And, John Curran, he pokes a little hole in the plot mechanics here because he says, how exactly did Poirot know that? Because, again, part of what's the fun of this mystery is that he doesn't really have any resources at hand, so he can't check up on that. But I guess he just surmises in that they're both American, and the fact that Lady Westholme was lying about the Bedouins' clothes and all of that there must have been something in the past, and he just kind of makes a leap of faith, and he turns out to be right.
Yeah,
but
it's a little far-fetched.
It's a little questionable.
Yeah, it is.
It's a little far-fetched. So I think it gets a ding for that, but that actually goes more toward mechanics than credibility anyway. What I would be inclined to do is a 6 for plot mechanics and an 8 for plot credibility.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. There are ways in which I could have flipped them, arguably, but I think so long as one of them has an 8, I think that's about right. I think that as a combined score, I agree with that.
Okay. Next, detective characterization. I'm a little mixed on this one in that we mentioned the oddness of seeing Poirot on page 1 and then losing him for so much of the book. That's one thing, and that's fine. I mean, it's not like we need to see Poirot on every page at this point. We've certainly seen enough of him, and so had Christie. But I had another problem, which was that I noticed in this book, once Poirot did come onto the scene, and especially in all of his conversations with Colonel Carberry, that he was oddly not Belgian sounding. Like, there are occasional Frenchisms in here, but I'd put it at about 10% of what we're used to hearing from Poirot when it comes to the sort of Frenchification of his voice. I actually pulled out one line that he says when Carberry asks him if he can solve the case as easily as Poirot claims. Poirot says, "I should be extremely surprised if I could not do so." That does not sound exactly like Poirot to me. It's just
no, but there's stuff like this. Poirot took a deep breath. It is perfect at that. Yes. I see exactly what you mean. It was so. It all fits in. She chose to live dangerously, la maman Boynton. And she paid the penalty.
No, absolutely. There are some Frenchisms, and I think partially it's that there's no Hastings, so there's no sort of the jocularity is often when the Frenchisms come in. And you could say that he's traveling. And when he's speaking with Dr. Gerard, certainly it would just be less of a difference. And I like the fact that she doesn't Frenchify Dr. Gerard that much because we would believe that he speaks English really well. So in terms of the Poirot of it all, I think it's okay. I think this is the category where the book is probably weakest. To be perfectly honest, I think that it's fine.
It's mostly that he is not in half of the book.
That's weird too. Absolutely agree. I did also appreciate that we get a reference to the ABC murders, by the way. Miss Pierce is like, I was actually working as a governess in Doncaster.
Yeah. Yep. So we get Cards on the Table, Murder on the Orient Express, and the ABC murders in this one.
It's good continuity. I would give it a 4 or a 5.
I guess 5.
Let's do a 5.
Yep.
And then one-off characters, I think, is where this book does really well. We've already talked about a lot of them. Her treatment of Dr. Gerard as a really intelligent and cultured Frenchman, as written by a British author who's often not given credit for her portrayal of foreigners, so to speak. I was impressed by her restraint. Sarah King is a great character.
I really like Sarah King.
She's rendered really, really well. Mrs. Boynton is, of course, very well drawn.
Scary.
very scary. Dr. Gerard, we just talked about. The Boynton children are, for the most part, done well. I don't know if Ginny ever completely felt like a real person to me, but you know what? She's suffering from delusions half of the book, so that's fine.
Nadine is also pretty good.
Yeah, Nadine is very well drawn. I think Lady Westholme I found interesting because I found her to be thinly drawn in that she was in that comedic vein of some Christie characters. You know, she's another laughable feminist a la Ariadne Oliver, which made me shake my head and be like, oh, Christie, you conservative you. But then that's purposeful, right? Because when she's revealed as the murderer, it makes that portrayal of her that much more powerful when she's revealed to actually be at the center of all of this. So I think we kind of have to give Christie credit there.
Yeah, her backstory is certainly interesting. I don't mean the criminal backstory. I mean the fact that she tried to get her husband to run for parliament. And that he was only really interested in hunting.
Right. I think, by the way, in the real Lady Astor, her husband got elevated to a lord. So then he was in the House of Lords. And that's when she was like, oh, I'll just run for your seat, essentially. And she did. She got it. A nit to pick in terms of Christie physical descriptions. Nadine Boynton is described as a, quote, Madonna carved in stone. Describing women as Madonnas, that's the female equivalent of the tanned men. I think an 8. I think this is really
I think they're good characters. Yeah.
And then setting and tone is, I also think, fairly good for a Christie novel and for any novel. I mentioned the fact on setting that per Janet Morgan, actually, this book began as a title in one of Christie's notebooks, Rose Red Murder or Rose Red Death. Petra was an important reference point, and you can tell setting isn't always important in her novels, but it certainly is here. And we get a lot of good descriptions of it. I thought that she did a better job of setting in Death on the Nile because I think it was woven into the story a little bit better. There are a lot of passages in here that feel a little bit like a tour guide book.
Yes, they do.
Like, okay, and now they just get plunked in awkwardly.
I literally yada, yada, yada them a few minutes ago on this podcast. So
yeah, there's a reason for that. This is so awkward, but I think it's when they're at the Dome of the Rock. Christie writes, strange, thought Sarah, that once a Jebusite should have made this rocky summit into a threshing floor, and that David should have purchased it for 600 shekels of gold and made it a holy place. It's like, am I reading Rick Steves?
No, Rick Steves' guide to Jerusalem.
Come on. Basically what I'm saying is she gets a B for effort.
Well,
when it comes to setting.
Well, the thing is, it's very detailed, and so some of it would be great if it were at all somehow woven into the plot.
Yeah.
Instead, it's just sort of like plopped on in there.
Just not made as big of a deal of and just like referenced in passing, which I still think she did fairly well in Death on the Nile, and which she certainly did really well in The Man in the Brown Suit.
Right.
So,
yes.
But I do think when it comes to tone, the tone is particularly good here because we've mentioned this sense of claustrophobia and just the psychological torture of the family.
And
we get that opening line.
And just a sense of dread.
The dread. I mean, that opening line you do see, don't you, that she's got to be killed really is a killer opening line.
I really like that actually they don't go to Petra for quite some time, that they're trapped in that hotel.
The fact that this ends on a Shakespeare quote, just no. Like, not even a good Shakespeare quote. Like, it's from Cymbeline. No one cares about Cymbeline. I'm sorry.
Oh,
anyway,
sorry.
I think a 7. If it were just tone, I think it would probably be an 8 or perhaps even a 9. The setting, I think, brings it down slightly, but it's still really good.
Yeah.
And then Stuck in Its Time. I mean, this is another one where I think Christie does really well. Just like with Death on the Nile, I was worried about a Christie novel from the late 30s set in the Middle East. But the only thing I thought was a little weird is that there is this runner involving the dragoman. I think Mahmoud is his name.
Yeah, his name's Mahmoud.
And he has this obsession with the Jews being evil. And certainly no one shares his obsession within the novel. There's no feeling that this is condoned in any way, but it's almost played as a joke. Like, oh, isn't that funny? He's so anti-Semitic and hates the Jews so much. Ha, ha, ha.
Well, yeah, it's not great. I would also say that it's Mahmoud who is the one who can't really be bothered to assign names to the Bedouins at Petra.
Yeah. Which I think is a little ridiculous, and maybe we can't quite give her the benefit of the doubt on that one.
Yeah, I don't know that we can. And he's very condescending about them. And also, there's an entire thing when it's talking about interviewing them that, well, you can't trust them because they're just going to blame one another.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, not great.
not great. And then we do get some of the other characters. Miss Pierce and Lady Westholm say some offensive things, as does Colonel Carberry. But as always, benefit of the doubt there, because that's just the characters speaking, not necessarily Christie.
Yeah, and then there's some real misogyny towards Sarah, but Sarah fights it back. So I mean, that's a character thing.
Totally. So I think one deduction,
Yeah,
because it's not pervasive, but it's there. There's a little bit there. All right, so let's tally this up. That gives us 6 plus 8 plus 5 plus 8 plus 7 minus 1 for a grand total of 33 points, putting Appointment with Death in 6th place, which is where Death on the Nile had just been. Appointment with Death is just edging out Death on the Nile. I do suspect that we, when we revisit our rankings, we will be reevaluating Death on the Nile. I think that Death on the Nile belongs ahead of Appointment with Death, personally.
I agree with you. I think that we will re-rank these.
We will revisit. So for now, here is our current top 10. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Murder on the Orient Express, Peril at End House, The Murder at the Vicarage, Cards on the Table, Appointment with Death, Death on the Nile, 3-Act Tragedy, The ABC Murders, and The Sittaford Mystery.
Yeah, it's always a little bit weird that the Sittaford Mystery somehow ended up in there.
I think we ranked Death on the Nile a little low and the Sittaford Mystery a little high. So this is all an ongoing process. So as we revisited it at the 1-year mark, we certainly will be doing so at the 2-year mark. That is how things stand for now, but not crazily out of whack either. I mean, I do think that both Death on the Nile and Appointment belong in the upper echelons of what we've read thus far.
You know, the other thing that I would say is I remembered what the plot of Appointment with Death was.
Did you?
Yeah, the malevolent mother figure was what I remembered about it. I don't think I remembered the details, but that I remembered.
Well, and what's interesting is that the next Poirot novel we have, which is Hercule Poirot's Christmas, also features a really horror show parent figure. He's a patriarch, but just back to back, she's got these really memorable, horrible characters.
Yeah, no, but I mean, what I was going to say is that while I suppose it should have been an indication, given that I hadn't read this in how many years, and I still remembered what it was about, it should have been some sort of sign that we were probably going to end up ranking this pretty high. But I don't think I expected to like it as much as I actually did. Yeah,
like I said, I think this is one where I didn't enjoy the reading experience as much as I was expecting to, because I did have in my head that this was one of the better Christies, if not among the short lists. So I didn't enjoy it as much. But then in thinking it over and really getting down to analyzing its various pieces and what it's doing, it's one of these ones where she's doing something interesting and different in terms of the tone and the focus on psychology and these characters. And it's hard not to credit her with that. So I respect it, even though I don't necessarily like it.
Yeah, that's totally fair.
All right, well, that is Appointment with Death. Join us next week for a short story. We are going back to Tommy and Tuppence. And the House of Lurking Death.
I like some Beresfords.
I do too. Tommy and Tuppence short stories are a nice contrast to the longer Poirot novels. And as we mentioned, the next novel is, of course, Hercule Poirot's Christmas, our final Poirot novel of the 1930s.
Look at that.
We did it.
We did it.
Almost,
yeah.
In the meantime, we would love to hear from you. Please contact us via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can also find Catherine at Brobcat. We are on Facebook. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is also at All About Agatha. And take a moment to rate and review us. We so appreciate when you do. We love hearing from you, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.